Mary Lincoln was the wife of the famed American president, Abraham Lincoln. She was the First Lady, was wealthy enough, and had a nice family, but in 1875, her own son had her sent to an insane asylum. So what happened to her? Was she really mad? And why did her son do this? To answer these questions, we first need to go back to the early 19th century. The woman who is primarily known today as the wife of Abraham Lincoln was born as Mary Ann Todd on the 13th of December 1818 in the town of Lexington in Kentucky. Her father was Robert Smith Todd, a man whose ancestors had played a prominent role in the American Revolutionary War. Robert had trained as a lawyer in his youth, but never went into private practice, instead starting various business ventures in Kentucky on what was then the American frontier. He also fought in the War of 1812 against the British, and it was around this time that he married his wife and Mary's mother, Elizabeth Todd. Yet, Mary's mother would sadly die owing to complications from childbirth when Mary was just 6 years old. The following year, Robert remarried, this time to an Elizabeth Humphreys. This second union would result in 9 children, so the Todd family was a large one. Still, they had the financial means for it to be comfortable the same, with their family living in a large residence with 14 rooms in the centre of Lexington. Mary was also afforded a good education for the time, with an emphasis on languages, the classics, dancing, music, and social etiquette. In other ways, her youth was difficult though, with her relationship with her stepmother being strained, and also being outnumbered by her many half-siblings. Kentucky was a slave-owning state, and the Todds were no different in this respect. At one point, they enslaved over a dozen people, mostly household workers of one kind or another. Their position in this regard reflected the conflicts which slavery was creating as a whole across the country. Eventually, the Todds would largely renounce slavery, but they lived on the frontier, where it was a controversial issue. In the middle decades of the 19th century, an uneasy agreement had been reached whereby the northern states on the east coast, like New Jersey, New York, Boston, and Connecticut, were becoming free states, where slavery was prohibited, while the southern states on the east coast like Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia continued to have their economies and societies based around slavery. But the real issue was whether or not the new states which were being admitted into the Union should be allowed to practice slavery. Kentucky and Tennessee were the first of these frontier states, but by the time Mary Todd was growing up in the 1820s and 1830s, the debate had moved further west to places like Missouri. These tensions would play a major role in Mary Todd's adult life. In 1839, when she was in her early 20s, Mary had moved to Springfield, the capital state of Illinois, a region which was experiencing a major influx of migrants in the 1830s and 1840s. Here she was regarded as a witty, outgoing young woman and was popular among the city's gentry. Initially, she was courted by the rising young lawyer and Democratic Party politician Stephen A. Douglas, but it was also at this time that she met Abraham Lincoln. At the time, Lincoln was a 30-year-old lawyer in Springfield, one who was not well known and had not entered into a political career yet. The two soon became close, but the relationship was peculiar. They soon agreed to marry, however they hesitated afterwards, with Lincoln becoming uncertain about the marriage and even calling it off at one point. Nevertheless, they would eventually wed on the 4th of November 1842 after a relatively long courtship by the standards of the 19th century. Despite its seemingly unusual beginning, Mary's marriage to Abraham was a happy one. They would have several sons, Robert born in 1843, followed by Edward 3 years later. Yet Edward would tragically die before his 4th birthday, owing to tuberculosis. 2 more sons followed, William born in 1850 and Thomas in 1853. The pair were also quite eccentric in their own ways. Lincoln was a mild-mannered and often distracted figure. His boys were known to go into the office, disrupting the business of his law partners. They frequently complained to Abraham about this, but he wouldn't do anything to fix the situation. For her part, Mary was a troubled woman in many ways. She had frequent mood swings, public outbursts, and a fierce temper. If she was living today, she would have been treated for one mental health ailment or another, but in the mid-19th century, no such diagnoses were made. She clearly suffered from depression and delusions, was possibly bipolar, and had numerous physical problems as well, such as diabetes and poor vision. Abraham started his political career as a local politician in Illinois in the mid-1840s, serving in the state legislature. It wasn't uncommon for individuals in leading professions like the law to hold such positions in the states at the time, and Abraham doesn't appear to have considered a career on the federal level of politics at this juncture. After a few years as he and Mary started their family, Abraham stepped back from politics and concentrated on his law practice. What drew him back into political life and onto the national stage was the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which opened the way for the extension of slavery into the new territories being created by the US government in the West. Lincoln soon emerged as a prominent figure within the newly formed Republican Party, which was anti-slavery and had only been established in 1854. Through a somewhat unusual series of events, he was catapulted from relative obscurity to become the Republican Party candidate in the 1860 US presidential election. Mary would be a stalwart, if sometimes unorthodox, support for Abraham on the campaign trail. She encouraged his growing political ambitions throughout the 1850s, and we might never have heard of Abraham Lincoln had it not been for Mary's urging of him to put himself forward for the presidency. She also seems to have had a hand in devising some of his political views. Conversely, she was seen as meddling by some sections of the press, while her willingness to bring journalists into the Lincoln home in Illinois and give them tours was viewed as eccentric. Abraham clearly viewed her as a partner in his career. When he won the election in 1860, he greeted her with the words, "Mary, we are elected." The position of the First Lady of the United States was one which had only entered the lexicon of US public affairs since the 1830s. Mary relished the role, though it was a difficult one for her and Abraham as well. The American Civil War broke out just months into Lincoln's time as president, owing to the belief that the new president intended to abolish slavery across the Union. Coming from a slave-owning background in Kentucky, Mary had many close relatives who fought on the side of the Confederacy, and several of her half-brothers were killed in action. However, she was vocal in her support for the Union and the cause of abolition. That said, she also generated controversy, in particular owing to her lavish spending on banquets and formal events at the White House, fine jewelry, and interior decoration, at a time when the rest of the country was suffering under the burden of the war, with many people lacking many of the basics of daily life. To those who knew how the Lincoln White House operated, they also viewed Mary as a meddling figure who distracted her husband from the important business of wartime government, with her frequent bouts of depression, mania, and generally erratic behavior. Her mental state was particularly bad in 1862, after she received news that her son William, or Willie, had passed away from typhoid fever. She was so devastated that she was bedbound for around 3 weeks, didn't attend the funeral, and was taken care of by a nurse for months. Lincoln had only barely won the 1860 election, owing to the divided nature of the Democratic Party at the time over the slavery issue. His popularity grew over time though, as did Mrs. Lincoln's reputation, in large part owing to her charitable work in the hospitals of the Washington, D.C. and Maryland region as the war went on. The Union would eventually emerge victorious in the conflict, ending slavery in the United States in the process. Mary had high hopes that she might become a more settled First Lady thereafter, but one John Wilkes Booth had other ideas. Booth was an actor and a supporter of the Confederacy, who on the 14th of April 1865 assassinated President Lincoln while he and Mary were watching a performance of the play our American cousin at Ford's Theatre in Washington, D.C. Mary was holding her husband's hand when he was shot in the back of the head. He would not die until the morning of the 15th of April, after being in a coma for several hours. Mrs. Lincoln had to be removed from the room at one point. Such was the level of her trauma. Mary Lincoln received considerable sympathy in the aftermath of her husband's assassination. The couple had suffered so much during the war, and now when it all seemed to be over and the war won, Mary's husband had been cruelly taken from her. Amongst the messages of condolences she received was a letter from Queen Victoria of Britain, a woman who had lost her own husband, Prince Albert, 4 years earlier in 1861, and who would never fully recover from the loss, wearing black mourning clothes for the rest of her life. Despite the messages of sympathy, Mary Lincoln soon found herself in something of a financial bind. Abraham had been successful both as a lawyer and as a politician, and had left her a sizable estate of well over $2 million in today's money. But Mary had always been a spendthrift, and her time as First Lady had only made these instincts worse. By 1868, she was advertising in the national media that she was broke and needed financial aid as the poor widow of the murdered president. She would spend many years thereafter trying to put herself on a better financial footing and living on financial support from family, friends, and former political allies of her husband. At one stage, this involved her and one of her sons, Tad, moving to Europe to live in Frankfurt with the Seligman family, Joseph Seligman being a Jewish German who had migrated to the United States, where he became a very successful businessman and helped raise an enormous amount of money for the Union War effort during Lincoln's presidency. Eventually, in the early 1870s, Congress voted an annual pension for Mary, but she was never on a sound financial footing after she squandered the estate her husband left on his death. The financial issues Mary faced after her husband's death placed a considerable strain on her always fragile mental health. This was compounded by the publication in 1868 of a book entitled Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, by Elizabeth Keckley. Keckley was a former slave who had become an employee of the Lincolns as a dressmaker, and later a close confidant and friend of Mary Lincoln. Mary considered the publication of the book, which included a huge amount of personal revelations about her and her deceased husband, a serious betrayal, and many people at the time considered it as being in bad taste. The result of all of this unrest and instability in her life, combined with the death of her son Thomas, or Tad, possibly from tuberculosis or a heart condition in 1871, led to a serious further decline in Mary Lincoln's mental health. She became erratic, paranoid, and prone to delusions. This culminated in 1875 when she visited her only surviving son Robert and became convinced that he was drastically ill, when in reality, the opposite was the case. During her visit with him, she told him that someone had tried to poison her on the train. She also spent large amounts of money on items she never used, and walked around the city with tens of thousands of dollars in government bonds sewn into her clothes. Eventually, Robert decided to have his mother committed. An insanity trial followed, one which generated a lot of public attention, given that it involved a former First Lady. Shortly after the court proceedings, Mary was in such a bad state of mind that it seems like she tried to take her own life. Well, she went to several pharmacies and ordered enough laudanum to kill herself, but an astute pharmacist picked up on this and instead gave her a placebo. Initially, Mary was committed to Batavia Asylum in Illinois, but thereafter complications in the case, notably the fact that Robert controlled his mother's finances and was deemed by many observers, possibly quite unfairly, to have ulterior motives in seeking to have his mother committed, began to emerge. Eventually, in 1876, Mary was declared to be competent enough to look after herself, and was given her liberty. It certainly was an unpleasant event in her life, and while Robert's character was called into question at the time, there is little doubt that Mary Lincoln's psychological state was not good in the 1870s. Mary headed back to Europe after the insanity case, and spent several years travelling in France and elsewhere. Her health declined further during these years, a development in large part attributable to several falls she suffered during her travels. By the early 1880s, at which time she was still just in her early 60s, she was back in America, and increasingly confined to her sister's house in Springfield, Illinois. She died there on the 16th of July 1882 after suffering a fall, one which quickly led to a coma and a heart attack. She was 63 years of age. One of the few saving graces of the troubles of her later life was that she and Robert did reconcile shortly before her death. Mary has generally been judged as a very average or even poor First Lady by historians, her various difficulties having distracted her husband from his official duties in a time of national crisis, though in recent times a more sympathetic portrait of her has emerged, not least following her portrayal by Sally Field in Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Mary Lincoln or Mary Ann Todd. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to leave them down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.